Malgré les mutins, tout réussira. Nos ennemis confus en restent là. Et nous allons chanter Alléluia.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Quand Boileau jadis du clergé parla, comme un prophète il a prédit cela, en chantant ma chansonnette. Ah, avec plaisir on dira, ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, malgré les mutins, tout réussira.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Pierrette et Margot chantent à la guinguette.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Réjouissons-nous, le bon temps viendra. Le peuple français, jadis acquilla, l'aristocrate dîner à culpa.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le clergé regrette le bien qu'il a, et c'est justice, la nation l'aura. Par le prudent Lafayette, c'est fini tout trouble, s'apaisera. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, malgré les mutins, tout réussira.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Suivant la maxime de l'évangile,
ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Du législateur tout s'accomplira. Celui qui s'élève, on l'abaissera. Celui qui s'abaisse, on l'élèvera.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le vrai catéchisme nous instruira, et l'affreux fanatisme s'éteindra, pour être à la loi docile. Et chaque Français s'exercera. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, malgré les mutins, tout réussira.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le peuple en ce jour sans cesse répète.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Et dans 2000 ans, on s'en souviendra. Le despotisme expirera. La liberté triomphera.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Nous n'avons plus ni nobles ni prêtres.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
L'égalité partout régnera. L'esclave autrichien le suivra. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Et leur infernal clique au diable s'envolera.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Les aristocrates à la lanterne. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Les aristocrates on les pendra. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le peuple en ce jour sans cesse répète.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Malgré les mutins, tout réussira. Nos ennemis confus en restent là. Et nous allons chanter Alléluia.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Quand Boileau jadis du clergé parla, comme un prophète il a prédit cela, en chantant ma chansonnette. Ah, avec plaisir on dira, ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, malgré les mutins, tout réussira.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Pierrette et Margot chantent à la guinguette.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Réjouissons-nous, le bon temps viendra. Le peuple français, jadis acquilla, l'aristocrate dîner à culpa.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le clergé regrette le bien qu'il a, et c'est justice, la nation l'aura. Par le prudent Lafayette, c'est fini tout trouble, s'apaisera. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, malgré les mutins, tout réussira.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Suivant la maxime de l'évangile,
ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Du législateur tout s'accomplira. Celui qui s'élève, on l'abaissera. Celui qui s'abaisse, on l'élèvera.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le vrai catéchisme nous instruira, et l'affreux fanatisme s'éteindra, pour être à la loi docile. Et chaque Français s'exercera. Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, malgré les mutins, tout réussira.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le peuple en ce jour sans cesse répète.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Et dans 2000 ans, on s'en souviendra. Le despotisme expirera. La liberté triomphera.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Nous n'avons plus ni nobles ni prêtres.
Ah ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
L'égalité partout régnera. L'esclave autrichien le suivra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Et leur infernal clique au diable s'envolera.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Les aristocrates à la lanterne. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Les aristocrates on les pendra. Ça ira, ça ira.
Le peuple en ce jour sans cesse répète.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Malgré les mutins, tout réussira. Nos ennemis confus en restent là. Et nous allons chanter Alléluia.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Quand Boileau jadis du clergé parla, comme un prophète il a prédit cela, en chantant ma chansonnette.
And here we are. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this live broadcast, thanks to your generosity and recording, is to get in day 276 of the project, our unified curriculum here at Apocatastasis, both for our private enrolled students, our alumni, and the larger learning community. And that includes you today as we get into the early career and indeed the stride of Napoleon Bonaparte. And we've finished our way through the directory, and we had a brief meditation on the rise of, well, what H.G. Wells calls the dawn of socialism. This meditation of some of the principles of the French Revolution had not been realized, certainly not by the directory. And so we see these seeds, frankly, that have been planted and that will really get a lot of attention in the following 2 centuries, the dawn of socialism. I want to just check the volume right now of the background music. Okay, we'll adjust that slightly before we get into our main work. There we go. Yeah, depending on the file and the jig and the reel and whatever, it can get higher or lower. But anyhow, here we are, and let's indeed get an advertisement for Apocatastasis queued up, and we'll go from there. And something that I'm very much looking forward to is Janice Barcello's autism webinar. So if you go on our great site, which is down below in the description, you can see this ultrasound autism connection webinar, which will be delivered in June, late June. Let's see here. The date in particular is June 26th, a Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. The cost is $100. However, Janice, you can see a photograph of herself here, a very accomplished author and speaker, has asked me to notify you that there is a sliding scale. So if you can pay $100, please do that to further her research. If you cannot, however, she does not want the cost to deter you from attending this seminar on the ultrasound autism connection. So Janice is open to a sliding scale where you can pay what you can. So you can check out this poster on our great website. Okay, so here we had somewhere here a painting of Napoleon. There we go. Looking over one battle or another. And that's what we're looking at today. And so, as we often do, we have a song, we have a poem looking at this man. And in this case, we often have a thematic selection. Not always, not always. And by the way, you can go to our website and get the outline of history, which we're making our way through. If you enroll in class, there will be an additional study of the story of civilization, and all of this integrated with literature. So the great genius of the project here at the Institute is the variability of it. So depending on your state in life and your ability to commit to reading every day and to lectures every day, there's variation. So you're getting here, what I'm doing right now is the introductory tier, so to speak, but this very project gets a lot deeper if you're interested in enrolling here at the college. Anyway, here's the song. This is the Grand Conversation on Napoleon. I believe this is a period folk song, maybe even an actual folk song, in the sense that we don't know the author, which is the qualification of being a folk song. It just exists amongst the people without any author attribution. I find that Frank Hart's version of this is great. You might want to look up Tony Rose as the version they're using here, so you can find a recording of your man. But here we go. The Grand Conversation on Napoleon. It was over that wild beaten track was set a friend of Bonaparte's. It paced the sands and lofty rocks of St. Helena shore. And if the wind blew a hurricane, the lightning fierce around did jar. The seagulls were shrieking and the waves around did roar. Ah, rush, rude winds, the stranger cried, while I ranged the spot where alas the gallant hero did his weary eyelids close. And though at peace his limbs do rest, his name will never be forgot. This grand conversation on Napoleon arose. "Oh, lass," he cried, "why England did you persecute that hero bold? Much better had you slain him on the plains of Waterloo. For Napoleon he was a friend to heroes all, both young and old. He caused the money for to fly where he did go. When plans were forming night and day, the bold commander to betray, he said, I'll go to Moscow and there I'll ease my woes. And if fortune smiles on me that day, then all the world shall me obey." This grand conversation on Napoleon arose. Oh, his men in thousands then did rise to conquer Moscow by surprise. He led his troops across the Alps, oppressed by frost and snow. And being near the Russian land, began to open his eyes, for Moscow was a-blazing, and the men drove to and fro. Napoleon dauntless viewed the plain, and then in anguish at the same, he cried, "Retreat, my gallant men, for time so swiftly goes." Ah, what thousands died in that retreat, some forced their horses for to eat. This grand conversation on Napoleon arose. Oh, at Waterloo they bravely fought, commanded by this Bonaparte, field marshal, nay, did him betray, but he was bribed by gold. And when Blucher led the Prussians on and nearly broke Napoleon's heart, he cried, "My 30,000 men are lost, and I am sold." He viewed the plain and cried, "All's lost," and then his favorite charge across the plain was in confusion with blood and dying woes. And the bunch of roses did advance and boldly entered into France. This grand conversation on Napoleon arose. Oh, this Bonaparte was planned to be a prisoner there across the sea. The rocks of St. Helena, oh, it was his final spot. And as a prisoner there to be till death, it did end his misery. His son soon followed to the tomb. It was an awful plot. And long enough have they been dead, the blast of war around is spread, and may our shipping float again to face the daring foes. And now, my boys, when our calls will boldly mount those wooden walls, this grand conversation on Napoleon arose. The grand conversation on Napoleon And as I mentioned the other day, one of the strange things about English folk songs is that they all tend to be rather sympathetic to Boney. And he tended to have that appeal that the English burgeoning working class, the English poor, certainly, saw in Napoleon well, at least at the very least, someone who was going to upset the order, which a beat down man can and quite oppressive. Enemy is my, and I think a lot of that explains the sympathy Napoleon gets in a lot of this English reminiscences from the street. Okay. And get into the outline of history by H.G. Wells and take things from there. Now, Wells is not particularly hagiographical when it comes to Napoleon Bonaparte. He's critical, if not even consistently critical, of the Corsican, of Les Petits Caporales. And he gives his reasons for that, which we might get into, and see if they're valid or not. But certainly, Napoleon strikes the imagination, whether one approves of him or likes him, if you like, or not, if only for his energy, his remarkable energy in life. The man is a whirlwind of activity. It's hard to imagine that one man did so much. He is at once a revolutionary, he is at once a monarchist, and a conservative. It's quite a combination. I suppose in some very vague simile, we might make an analogy with Napoleonism or Bonapartism, as the British called it at the time, and the MAGA movement, where in these United States you have a conglomeration of various factions that have coalesced into its own creature, I might say. So the same with Napoleon. We might say he's an early 19th century version of the MAGA movement. You know, if the Jacobins were something with some justice, like an ISIS saying to hell with the world, we declare war on you, we might say the same with Bonapartism. It's a cobbling together of different ideologies and so forth, apparently all to the great success of Old Boney. We're going to read a bit here from the outline of history, and then we'll get into some of the maps, just so we can orient ourselves properly. I find maps with younger students in particular are especially onerous and avoided, although I don't know why. All right, so in this section here, chapter 36, the sections for this week are Bonaparte's family in Corsica, Bonaparte as a Republican general, Napoleon the first consul, and then for tomorrow, Napoleon as emperor, 100 days. A lot happens between 1804 and 1814, and then the Congress of Vienna, and so forth. Of course, we would be remiss to forget the tragedy of St. Helena, a distinctively British punishment for its pettiness and its cruelty, the exiling of Napoleon to Helena, of which there are also folk songs. But let's just get our whistle wet here, and we'll do that with old H.G. Wells. And he says, now we come to one of the most illuminating figures in modern history, without a doubt. The figure of an adventurer and a wrecker, whose story seems to display with extraordinary vividness the universal subtle conflict of egotism, vanity, and personality with the weaker, wider claims of the common good. Just strapping down the other pages here so we have less to wrestle with. Against this background of confusion, stress, and hope, this strained and heaving France and Europe, this stormy and tremendous dawn, appears this dark little archaic personage, hard, compact, capable, unscrupulous, imitative, and neatly vulgar. He was born in 1769 in that age of Voltaire, that age of fermentation that will give us the French Revolution, in a still half barbaric island of Corsica. So that's, of course, ironic that any more than Stalin is Russian, right? Stalin was from Georgia, not Russia, and Napoleon was from Corsica. And we'll look at the map soon enough. Corsica is one of those islands, Sardinia and Corsica, off of the south coast of France and we'll say the west coast of Italy. So he's from Corsica, and it's not the last island we'll see in Napoleon's day. The son of a rather prosaic father, a lawyer who has first been a patriotic Corsican against French monarchy. So that's also interesting that Napoleon, his family, has this hostility to France, especially when they were trying to subjugate Corsica. But the father had then gone over to the side of the invader. His mother was of sturdier stuff, passionately patriotic, and a strong and managing woman. And something else that's going to come up a lot in this chapter, not a lot, but it comes up again and again. The mother birched, that is to say, she hit him with a stick as a punishment. On one occasion, she birched Napoleon, a good verb, when he was 16. And we're going to see how that plays a role. In fact, when Napoleon becomes emperor, we have this very interesting vignette. Of course, I'm going to fill in what happens between his 16th year and his 32nd year soon enough. But just to jump ahead here, the good lady, his mother, Napoleon's mother, who had birched the man of destiny at age 16 for grimacing at his grandmother, was neither dazzled nor deceived by him at the age of 32. All France might worship him, but she had no illusions. She put by the money Napoleon sent her, and she continued her customary economies. And here you go, pay attention. When all is over, you will be glad of my savings. And we're going to keep that in mind, right? There's a sense, as you read the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, that things are too good to be true. This can't last. This can't last. Not the least of all because Napoleon does represent concretely not just a force on the margins of society in terms of his political Bonapartism and what that means, but also that he's able to do it successfully. So he represents for the power structure throughout Europe. He represents both an outside threat, and because of the competence of his administration and his army, no less, he also represents a very real threat. He's not a potential threat or something that would stick in the craw of a ruler in the sense of the Jacobins, who are far too hot-headed to have any long-term legacy. Yes, when you have the story of Napoleon, yes, you have this idea that it's not going to last, but there are intrinsic strengths to it because it's not fanatical and because it's a much more measured approach to human government than the Jacobins were during the Reign of Terror. You do have this realization that Bonapartism is far more of an annoyance and far more of a threat to the ruling order of Europe than Jacobinism ever was. So, just using this as a brief outline. So, Napoleon, after his father comes around to French rule, will end up going to a military academy in France ultimately. He studies in Corsica, of course, but then he goes to Briand, Corsica, and then in Paris. And he moved into the artillery, which was the hot... Oh, can't you see my pointer? He moved into the artillery, which was the hot field in the early 19th century. And it would remain so, arguably, the rise of artillery. Obviously, munitions are getting better. They're getting more sophisticated. And we see, of course, in any artilleryman we see the necessity of mathematics. So we want to apply that focus and that specialty of Napoleon to the remainder of his life. Having a mathematical view of things and very plotting. Just as a math problem is very ordered, a very ordered and plotting way to get from point A to point B. So we want to always keep that in mind, that as an artilleryman, Napoleon is heavily trained in mathematics. He was an industrious student of both math and history, and his memory was prodigiously good, particularly with history. He almost has an unlimited store, or it seems that way, of historical references that he will constantly fall back on, not the least of which was Rome. Of course, very, very much of the late 18th century, the obsession on Rome. These notebooks of Napoleon's from school show no very exceptional intelligence, and they contain short pieces of original composition upon suicide and similar adolescent topics. He fell early on the spell of Rousseau and developed a sensibility and a scorn for the corruptions of civilization. In 1786, he wrote a pamphlet against a Swiss pastor who had attacked Rousseau. So interesting, right? We're going to see this again. He has this very romantic, revolutionary aspect to him. And then again, he is a man of the military and a man of mathematics and a man of order. And even here in this observation, just in this paragraph, we can draw conclusions that within Napoleon, we see these seemingly contradictory elements of Bonapartism as a political philosophy, both the hot-headed revolutionary Rousseau back to nature and the discipline necessary to bring this about, and also as part of that maturity, the discipline necessary and needed to tamp things down and to tamp down some of that revolutionary ardor. Sometimes you have to mute things in order in the big picture to spread your ideas, and that will certainly be the case with Napoleon's chapter in liberalism. Out, Napoleon will find himself on the side of the National Guard. We'll get to our map of Egypt shortly, but Napoleon will be on the revolutionary side, not necessarily as a revolutionary, but as a French citizen and a French fighter, and that's the regime, and he's loyal to the regime and to the state. To say nothing of his fondness for Rousseau along with the revolutionaries. And what happens is Napoleon ends up down in Spain, and then soon enough in Italy. And we read here that Napoleon's successes in Italy were brilliant and complete. And Napoleon had the option of going to fight in the Vendée, this internal civil war that we spoke about last week, this rising of peasants and clergy in the west of the country, the subject of Victor Hugo's novel 93, which for the third time I'm going to suggest is a much tighter and better story than Les Miserables. As cool as Les Miserables is, I think you'll find that 93 it's Victor Hugo at his best. It's also Victor Hugo's last story. And 93 deals with the fight between the Jacobins and the Catholics in the Vendée, of which almost every character is heroic, incidentally. Anyway, Napoleon did not want to sully himself with the dirt, shall we say, of a civil war. And so he took up commissions in Spain and in Italy. And these successes were brilliant and complete. He had wanted to go into Italy because there lay the most attractive task. He had risked his position in the army, by refusing to take up, as I said, the irksome duties of a command against the rebels in La Vendée. He had been a great reader of Plutarch's Lives and of Roman history, as was everyone in the late 18th century. We people in Connecticut dressed in togas at the time, literally, in our revolution. And Napoleon's extremely active imagination was now busy with dreams of the revival of the eastern conquests of the Roman Empire. Amazing again and again how people have these visions of Rome. It just comes up. It's like, as Toynbee says, it's almost like a zombie that keeps coming up in Western imagination, the Roman Empire and the universal state. Napoleon got the Republic of Venice out of his way by cutting it up between the French and Austria, securing the Ionian Islands and the Venetian fleet for France. The Peace of Campo Formio proved a bad bargain for both sides. The new Republic of France, pay attention, assisted in the murder of an ancient republic. And so now we have the meditation on memory. I thought there were no republics since the ancient world until America and France came along. Well, that's not quite true, though our memory might keep it so. Don't forget that Venice, for much of the medieval and modern time, was such a republic, as were many of the northern Italian city-states. To say nothing of the Hanseatic League up in northern Europe. But in memory, none of this exists because of France and America. Napoleon carried his point against a considerable outcry in France. Austria got Venetia, in which land in 1918 she was destined to bleed to death. There were also secret clauses by which both France and Austria were later to acquire German territory. And it was not only the Roman push eastward that was now exciting Napoleon's brain. This was the land of Caesar. And Caesar was a bad example for the successful general of a not very stable republic. Caesar had come back from Rome, rather he had come back to Rome from Gaul, a hero and a conqueror. His imitator, Napoleon, would come back from Egypt and India. Egypt and India were to be Napoleon's Gaul. And then we get into an explanation of the Egyptian campaign, which is one of those moments, almost like the Battle of Valmy during 93, when you can see a new aspect of military history is in the offing. So just as at the Battle of Valmy, we can see what the Lévé-en-Masse was portending for the coming of military organization, that the conscription model was going to be the way that armies were filled going into the future. It was so successful and so unexpected at Valmy that it leaves that impression. And that impression is in the pudding. You can see that conscription is adopted for the next 200 years in Western armies. Now, when it comes to the Battle of the Pyramids, right across the Nile from Cairo, of course, you have a similar stark reality where you have the Ottoman Egyptians in this case, and they are just mopped. They're used like a mop by Napoleon on the battlefield. And, a few hundred Frenchmen are killed and wounded compared to 25,000 Ottoman soldiers. It is such a discrepancy in casualties that you see as well that something new is in the offing. In this case, weaponry. The weaponry of the Berbers, the Berber Ottomans, is no match for the French artillery and the French muskets and so forth. And you can really see a massive discrepancy that's rising between Western firepower and, in this case, Arab firepower. So this is the Battle of the Pyramids, and it's a real turning point. Now, rather starkly on the following page, he does point out something, as whimsical as Napoleon is. Not all fun and games. And that is this notice here. Napoleon's Egyptian expedition was the rashest attempt history records. Napoleon was left in Egypt with the Turks gathering against him, and his army infected with plague. Nevertheless, Napoleon went on for a time with his eastern scheme. He gained a victory at Jaffa, probably with dreams of crusaders in his mind. Being short of provisions, he massacred all his prisoners. Right? I mean, that's very stark. In fact, it's so stark that H.G. Wells puts it in italics. Napoleon massacred all his Arab prisoners at Jaffa. He then tried to take Acre, where his own siege artillery, just captured at sea by the British, was used against him. Returning, baffled to Egypt, he gained a brilliant victory over the Turkish forces at Abu Qir, and then deserting the army of Egypt. There's another thing, right? I mean, we tend to look at Napoleon, I would, as I intimated with the folk song in English, somewhat sympathetically. And yet this is hard altogether to sympathize with. Certainly the massacre of prisoners, and then I would say just as much deserting his army in Egypt. That's one of the strange things about Napoleon, in fact, is that he's able to consistently garner unbelievable amounts of devotion from his men. When we get to the Moscow campaign tomorrow, men will break through the ice, and as they're drowning in freezing water in the middle of the night, the last name they're shouting as they're being submerged is Napoleon's. Vive l'Empereur! It's remarkable the devotion Napoleon, who was kind of a bastard to his army time and again, was able to garner, indeed. And it held on his army in Egypt till 1801, when it capitulated to a British force and made his escape back to France. Napoleon narrowly missed capture by a British cruiser off Sicily. Will not be the last time he's pursued by British ships, as we'll find out. Here was failure enough to discredit any general, the Egyptian campaign, had it been known. But the very British cruisers, which come so near to catching Napoleon, helped him by preventing any real understanding of the Egyptian situation from reaching the French people. Okay. Now, what happens there is he comes back. Here we go. And this is the coup that we're going to see. This is the coup that will bring Napoleon into political power. Right now, he's been a notable, even famous general. But now we're going to see a new chapter opening with Julius Caesar rather than George Washington at the back of his mind. Napoleon responded to the demand of his time. A conspiracy against the Directory was carefully engineered, and they're going to replace the Directory, which had been in place for about 4 years now, by 3 consuls, very Roman. Everybody seemed to have been reading far too much Roman history just then, of whom Napoleon was to be the chief, right? The 3 consuls, that obviously brings the triumvirates to mind. The working of that conspiracy is too intricate a story for our space. It involved a Cromwell-like dispersal of the House of Lords. This, or not the House of Lords, but the lower house, the Council of 500. And in this affair, Napoleon famously lost his nerve. The deputy shouted at him and hustled him, and he seemed to have been frightened. Napoleon nearly fainted, stuttered, and could say nothing. But the situation was saved by his brother Lucien, who brought in the soldiers and dispersed the council. The 3 consuls were installed at the Luxembourg Palace with 2 commissioners to restructure the constitution. So nominally, Napoleon is ruling with 2 others, but in reality, he is the head honcho. He is the first consul, and that's the first of hierarchy. With all his confidence restored and sure support of the people, Napoleon took the high hand with his colleagues and the commissioners. The constitution was produced, in which the chief executive officer, Napoleon, was to be called the first consul with enormous power. He was to be Napoleon. This was part of the constitution. He was to be reelected or replaced at the end of 10 years. Compare that to the American 4 years at their constitution at that time. He was to be assisted by a council of state appointed by himself, type of cabinet, which was to initiate legislation and send proposals here, especially if you want to compare to the American situation. So in Napoleon's setup, there are 2 bodies, just like in America, and just like in ancient Rome, by the way, the Senate and the Centuriata Comitata. What are they in France? The legislative body which could vote but not discuss legislation, and the tribunate, which could discuss legislation but not vote. It's always interesting in these constitutions to see how things are structured. So you have the legislation could vote but not discuss, tribunate could discuss but not vote, always trying to diffuse power. These members were selected by a third body, the appointed Senate, a special class, the notabilities of France, who were elected by the notabilities of the commune, who were elected by the common voters. The suffrage for the election of the notabilities of the commune was universal. Something coming right out of the French Revolution there. This was the sole vestige of democracy in the astounding pyramid. Interesting way to describe the Constitution of Napoleon. Okay, so what I want to do now is change our view and then take a look as we knock off at the map so that we can orient ourselves to the great campaigns which are in the offing. Again, we were just reading from the outline of history, which you can find freely on our project page for our enrolled students, our alumni, and also our distant supporters. So you can find this text and join us every day for that. But for right now, I'm going to change the map, change the image, and put on a map of the Napoleonic footprint, let's say. And I think the one I want to close up on is this guy here. Just let me get that queued up so you can see the powers that Napoleon is up against. So what we're seeing here, of course, is a map of Europe and, shall we say, Northern Asia. And at this point, Napoleon's Eastern holdings are not quite there yet, but this is ultimately going to be, once he becomes emperor, the state of things. So you can see Napoleon has much of Western Europe on lockdown, but very necessary to notice is that there are some non-hackers that are going to catch up with him, of which the most persistent, I will not say the most formidable, the most persistent were the British. This is called, in a lot of folk songs at the time, the Bonnie Bunch of Roses. In fact, the poem song that we began this class with referred to the Bonnie Bunch of Roses. Let me see that line here. And that refers to England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Yes, here we go. It's from the second to the last stanza. I'll read a few lines before. He viewed the plain at Waterloo and cried, "All's lost," and then his favorite charger crossed. The plain was in confusion with blood and dying woes. And the bunch of roses did advance and boldly entered into France. This grand conversation on Napoleon arose. So the bunch of roses did advance and boldly entered into France. So we'll talk about the bunch of roses. That is to say, the British, who are time and again cobbling together these coalitions. And I will get the proper number for you and I tomorrow, but it's an absurd amount. Napoleon just keeps slaughtering these coalitions, and the British keep putting them together, often without any British soldiers involved. Just like the Americans now, the British were very good at getting other people to fight their war, so they would keep coming. It was almost, I would say, to make sense of what's going on in Ukraine and some of the stubbornness of the Western NATO people, I would imagine very much that they have the British coalitions in mind. When you ask yourself, how can they just keep pumping up this corpse of Ukraine, and they just keep shoveling money and weapons that they don't have? Even the Americans don't want anything to do with Ukraine anymore. And the British and the NATO people behind them are still pushing. I would bet dollars to donuts that in their minds, that they're thinking about the Napoleonic coalition, and it just kept getting destroyed, but the British just kept doggedly putting together new coalitions until they ground down Napoleon. So I think there's a little bit of an echo of the past going on in the present war in Ukraine. In any case, keep that in mind. The British are plotting. Remember, going back uh, some time, that the British have the policy, certainly at this time and before, of what's called the balance of power. That is to say, the British will always back the weakest power on the continent. They want the continent, almost like the Pope wanted Italy, all broken up into power factions. The British wanted the continent of Western Europe broken up. And as a policy, they would and always do support the weakest state in order to balance that power there, in order to keep the continental Europeans sufficiently weak, frankly. So we'll look at the coalitions. Tomorrow, we'll look, of course, at Napoleon's disastrous campaign in Moscow, his exile to Alba, his return, the glorious 100 Days, glorious in song and story, and, of course, the final end of Napoleon on St. Helena. Remarkable, once again, the energy of this man. But for now, we're going to bring down the bird. I'll turn on the old camera here and we'll sew us up for the day. Okay, so here we go. We've moved a few steps along in our study of the project. You can find everything you need at our proper website, including previous classes, and we encourage you to join us. Perhaps you cannot commit much to it, and these daily classes and the daily readings of poetry and prose are enough, and perhaps you want a bit more and you want that one-on-one classroom setting. Well, you can check out and consider enrolling in Apocatastasis. We have in-person classes here in Connecticut, as well as online option, and get way deeper into these topics than simply these passing remarks that we get into, you and I, every morning. So with that, you can check out all out in the description below. Also, please consider attending Janice Barchetto's Autism Ultrasound webinar on the 26th of June. The tuition is on a sliding scale. Janice wanted me to let you know that. So if you do not have the $100, then Janice will work with you and see what you have. And you and I will have a great webinar at the end of the month. So thank you so much. I'll see you tomorrow as you continue the career of Old Boney. All right. Have a great, grand, holy day.